Hello again. I've talked before about the way in which the history of slavery, which was common across the entire world throughout the whole of recorded history, has now been reduced to the slave trade and universally acknowledged to relate in the main to the traffic in black slaves between West Africa and the Americas, which took place for a period of only about 300 years or so. Part of this is, of course, related to the fact that the rest of the world copies America in cultural trends, which I find regrettable, to say the least of it. It is inevitable this will skew any sort of discussions in the rest of the world about the history of slavery. This means that white men trading in black slaves has come to be seen as the slave trade. That slavery was a common practice in Africa long before the arrival of white people is fast being erased from history. I picked up this book in a charity shop recently. It was published in 1998 and contains brief personal accounts of various historical events from ancient Greece and Rome right up until the 1980s and 1990s. One of these eyewitness accounts is a passage from Olaudah Equiano's autobiography. As some readers will know, this was an Igbo boy who became a slave at about the age of 11 and later settled in London and wrote his life's history, which was published in 1789. Here is how the extract from his story reads in this book. I give details of the book in the description to this video, and I am reading now from page 170. My father had a numerous family, of which 7 lived to grow up, including myself and sister, who was the only daughter. Now, there is an ellipsis following my father. I don't know if people can see that there. My father is followed by 3 dots, which indicates that there is some missing part to the text. One might guess that this was a long passage, perhaps, which had no bearing on the subject. But no, in fact, just 3 words have been left out. My father, something, had a numerous family. As you can see, this is a longish extract. There'd be plenty of room for those missing 3 words. What was it about those 3 words that made it so important that they were excised from the text? I can see you're all interested. Okay, in the description of this video, I give a link to Olaudah Equiano's book, which you can read online through Project Gutenberg. And it is from this which I now quote. My father, besides many slaves, had a numerous family. You see what's been done there? The idea that this famous black man who was a victim of the transatlantic slave trade came from an African family which themselves owned slaves is regarded as shockingly indelicate and something to be censored. Yep, mention of black people owning slaves is not what we really want to hear about these days. I've seen this done in other places, most awfully in children's books. Later on, we read a most affecting scene because he and his sister have been captured by slavers and they are separated to be sold to different owners. The next day proved a day of greater sorrow than I had yet experienced. My sister and I were then separated. Then he talks of his natural grief at the separation. Then we have more ellipsis, 3 dots, before I was soon put down under the decks, and there I was, right under the decks, he's on a slave trader's ship run by white people. Okay, what do you think has been omitted there? This is fairly neat, really, because it makes a perfect narrative that fits in with the idea of the slave trade. The standard narrative of a boy from West Africa seized by slavers, loaded onto a ship to be taken to America. Except, of course, that's not at all what Equiano's own account says. He was actually captured by Igbo slavers and sold to an Igbo family, where he worked as a slave. That's what those three dots are trying to avoid telling us. This was very common in Benin and the surrounding areas. It's what is now southeast Nigeria, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Igbo territory of that time. This was nothing whatever to do with white people. There's a whole passage in Olaudah Equiano's book about his life of slavery in Africa amongst the Igbos. That's why the mention of the slaves which his father owned was removed at the beginning of this passage. This is a classic instance of the way in which the history of slavery in Africa has been distorted and erased. It was this tradition of slavery within African society which made the whole transatlantic slave trade possible. The crews of slave ships did not go off and capture slaves, they simply bought them from Igbo slave traders who had been in business there from the dawn of time. Here is another version of Olaudah Equiano's story, and this one is from University College London's website, to which I give a link in the description to this video. We read that his autobiography tells us that slavers captured him when he was about 12 and he was taken to the Americas. Very cunningly done, you see. Anybody reading that would assume that he had been taken by white slavers and transported at once to America. In this way, the history of what has become known as the slave trade is transformed into the history of wicked white people treating black people cruelly. Always the white people are the villains and always the black people are the victims. Of course, in real life, things are usually a little more complicated than that. The edited extract I read earlier was published in 1998. By that time, the myth was well established and it was felt to be almost indecent to mention the idea of black Africans owning slaves. It was not the case 40 years earlier, though. Here is a Ladybird book which cost a shilling in 1960. Here is an account of the slave trade in Africa in the 1860s, long after Britain had suppressed the slave trade at sea. It says, what was known as the slave trade was being carried on all over this part of Africa. Men, women and children were captured by fierce savages and then sold as slaves. Livingstone determined to do what he could to stop this terrible state of things. And then he says here the slave raiders were not long in trying to revenge themselves on Livingstone. Here's a picture which shows Livingstone with all black people. He's driving off black slave traders. It's obvious from the book that we're talking now about black slaves and black slave trading. Sometime between the publication of this book in 1960 and the publication of the other one in 1998, the idea that black people in Africa owned and traded in slaves became unacceptable and something not fit to be printed or even talked about. This period coincided with a wave of immigration to Britain from the Caribbean and Africa. I'm wondering if some misplaced sense of delicacy lies behind this censorship, a desire not to upset or offend black people. Whatever the reason, the history of Africa and slave trade as it is now presented is a false one. It ties in perfectly with the political agenda of critical race theory, of course, with its dislike and mistrust of white people. I can't see true history emerging anytime soon from this fog of propaganda and deceit.